Hi, and welcome back to this option in exploring Entering the Passion of Jesus by Amy Jill Levine, AJ as I will call her. This is the non-interactive option, so there are two Zoom options in which there is an opportunity for more interaction and learning collectively, and I certainly encourage you to be part of those, one on Wednesday night and one on Thursday during the day. So this is brief, and I'm trying to make it as good and as engaging as I can with the material, but it's a little challenging to try to adapt it to just be an opportunity in which you can participate this way. The opening activity that we are encouraged to explore is by taking money, if you have some at home, taking some money that you may have and exploring this. And part of that is because the incidents that are what we are looking at here at the temple, the last time of the last episodes of Jesus's public ministry, two of them have to do with money. And so taking a moment to think about our money, thinking about the most prominent images that is on our money. I have a dollar bill here. The most prominent words, so that which we truly can read out on our money. What they evoke as far as our feelings go about our country, or the country that's issued the currency. I should have maybe had some other country's currency just as a point of reflection. So what does it say that we value? What does this say that the people of the United States value? Who we are, what we stand for. How do these values impact those who carry the currency and use the money? So take a moment and take a bill out of your pocket if you have them and think about those questions. What's the most prominent images? What words do you find on there? How do they make you feel about this country and its currency? What do you think it says about what we value? What does it say about who we are and what we stand for? And how much of a claim do these values have on us as a people who carry and use this money? All right, maybe you'll pause right now and take a little bit to reflect and answer those questions. If you don't have a dollar bill around, you can use the one I'm showing here to reflect on those questions. Let us move into a word of prayer. We are following you, Jesus, down the paths that challenge our allegiances and risk our comforts. We are watching to see what you will do. Will you say the unexpected thing or do the unexpected? Will you be true to whom we assume you are, or will you surprise us once again? We see the costly journey of your passion, and we wonder at the risks you took. We want to believe like you believe. In the power of God's love. Amen. So if you tuned in on Sunday, you know that I read these 3 episodes in the temple in their chronological order as they appear biblically. We're going to kind of reverse that and start with the middle one, then explore the last one before we go to the first one. Now, the middle one is what we commonly call the greatest commandment. From Mark, it reads as following. This is Mark 12:28 through 34. One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he, Jesus, answered them well, he asked him, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There's no other commandment greater than these." Then the scribe said to him, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and besides him there is no other, and to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself. This is much more important than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." After that, no one dared ask him any question. Now, Jesus sums up the law, which is some 613 statutes in total, by lifting up two Old Testament commands as the primary ones. So he's not saying anything new here. These are ones that are already around: loving God and loving neighbor. If we really want to distill it down simply into what he said, love God, love neighbor. So there's a number of places that we can find these commandments in the Old Testament, but two such places include Deuteronomy 6 and Leviticus 19. And I'm going to read from those. This is the New Revised Standard Version that I'm reading. And in Deuteronomy 6, we find it starting in verse 4 there, and it reads, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might." So there is what we get from Deuteronomy 6. Now, we don't find there anything about neighbor. Now, you can read on in Deuteronomy 6, and there's more instructions that is there, but that's one place that we find some of what Jesus recites. Now, from Leviticus 19, let me see here. We get a much longer number of statutes. I'm trying to see if there is a place here in Deuteronomy 19 that we can find that succinctly mentioned. And my guess is really we start right at the beginning of Deuteronomy 19. Yeah, I think that's where we're really going to find it. And that's God speaking to Moses and says, it's a little harder to find it here, honestly. But you'll find what we would call the classic 10 Commandments, or what a life of holiness looks like. So I'll read just a little bit to you. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all of the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. You shall each revere your mother and father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make cast images for yourselves. I am the Lord your God." I wanted to kind of jump here. Some of the interesting things I think that we can find love of neighbor is, you shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. You shall not reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There we go. I am the Lord. So there is that one. Finally, I found it. So we do find in both those places that Jesus is taking statutes that already existed in the Old Testament. We don't find, he's not saying anything new. So this is not a revolution of ideas that he has here. Now, it is interesting for us to explore. We know the great commandment. We know this commandment to love. We know even how it is later put in John when Jesus washes the disciples' feet, the great commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. But what it asks of us is to really explore, what does it mean to love God? And what does it mean to love our neighbor? And if we took the commands seriously, what would have to change in our lives? What would our lives look like? What would our churches look like? Our communities of faith look like if we really took these two commands seriously? Love God, love neighbor. What would we have to risk, or what would we put at risk if we took these commandments more seriously? I want to read a little bit from AJ on this greatest commandment. This is going to be a little bit longer of a reading. And if you have the book, this starts on page 81. But I think that she expresses this well, and so I want to let her do the speaking here. And she writes, "When we talk about loving God and loving neighbor, what do we mean by that? I love you, so I'll accept your invitation to dinner, or I love you and I'll water your plants while you're on vacation. But what about I love you and I'll give my life for you? The love commandment, together with the question of the greatest commandment, should also make us think about less drastic concerns. How much do we love God? Is our response, of course I love God, but I have a golf game on Sunday morning, so I'll need to leave service early? How much do we love one another? Of course I love my friend, but I really don't have time to visit her in the hospital because I have a chapter on Jesus and healthcare due to my editor. We should also see the great commandment, the love of God and the love of neighbor, infusing the rest of the Passion story. If we want to love God with our whole hearts and soul, mind and might, we also need to think about how we deal with those moments when we do not feel God's love. When we, to quote the psalmist, this is Psalm 23, verse 4, walk through the valley of the shadow of death. We realize that whatever love we may have for God, God's love for us is even stronger. Jesus again provides the model for us. Let me go ahead and finish off this section as she writes. When Jesus prays in Gethsemane, "Let this cup pass from me," he is showing his tremendous love of God. He shows enough trust that he can say what he thinks. This love of God means that we can be fully honest with God. We can say what is on our hearts and in our minds, no matter how painful those comments may be. That is what lament psalms do. That is why Jesus on the cross cries out the first line of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He knows that the psalm continues, "For he did not despise or abhor the affliction of the afflicted. He did not hide his face from me, but heard me when I cried to him." The honest cry, the deep feeling of abandonment is not the end of the psalm or the story or the good news. So there's a little more on that great commandment. Now let's move to the second episode, which is the poor widow in the temple. This is just 3 verses that I will read first. "He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, 'Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on.'" The place in the temple where these gifts were given would have produced a lot of noise by putting in coins. For those who have been in England, the British pound, the coin, is the heaviest of all of the coins, and so therefore in that case would make more noise. And so we can think of what's mentioned here. Those who are putting in a lot had a lot of noise, as maybe you've been past a Coinstar at Wegmans. As all of that change goes in, that is a recognition of the generosity of their gifts, where she just has 2, which isn't going to make a lot of noise in the treasury as they are placed in. Now, Jesus has already warned about making a show of your faith, and there is a question about the heart of things in this, if everything is about the show of faith. I want to turn to her again as she writes about this, because it helps, I think, express what the point of the offering was in the temple, and that can help us understand more of the story than just thinking of making a show or thinking about her particular contribution. So she's speaking about the widow here when she writes, "She's in the temple and we should see her there for at least 5 reasons. First, and most important, she knows that this institution will provide for her as it did for the prophet Anna, the widow whom we met earlier in the temple in Luke 2:36. When congregants come to church on Easter Sunday after they have spent time observing Lent, finding just the right tie or just the right pair of shoes, do they consider who might be in need? Second, the temple is a place, as the church should be, that welcomes both rich and poor. Yet there are a number of churches where a poor person lacking the right clothes or the right zip code would fear to step. More, there are a number of churches where formerly well-off people, whose investment failed, whose accounts are depleted because of medical bills, who have overextended, try to keep up appearances. They are among us, just hanging on, afraid to say anything. They need to know that the church will help them, support them, and not shame them. The third, the temple, as the church should be, is a place where all donations are of value. I'm going to skip right to the source here. Fourth, we are reminded, if we see this widow as Jesus sees her, that the Jewish system does not blame poverty on sin. And finally, we must see this widow. We must see her. See her, welcome her, value her. She speaks a lot more, but those are the 5 things that she says in regards to this story. And let me just read them, highlight them again. She knows the institution will provide for her. The temple is a place that welcomes rich and poor. The temple is a place where all donations are of value. Fourth, if we see this widow as Jesus sees her, that the Jewish system does not blame her poverty on sin. And finally, we must see this widow welcomed and valued. So when we explore this story, we get caught up in her offering, but we really have to look more at how that offering represents a self-sacrifice. How did she see or know or acknowledge, as AJ just said, that the temple system was going to support the poor, which could also come to include her through her very gift? How does that reflect in what we as a faith community maintain? Do we do the same? Do we make sure that we support the most vulnerable and other vulnerable people in our community? What more could we do? How is it asking that of us and of us individually? Now, the last episode, which is actually the first episode, is this interaction, this question about taxes that comes from the Pharisees and the Herodians to Jesus. I'll read it through and then provide a few questions to ponder to conclude this time today. Then they sent to Jesus some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he said. And they came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, "Why are you putting me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me see it." And they brought one. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Jesus said to them, "Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were utterly amazed at him. Now, Jesus is aware of the hypocrisy of those who are coming to question him. But the Pharisees and the Herodians had interests that are familiar to us. So it has to do with thinking about this occupying state and what it means to have this occupying state, and if using their currency is an endorsement of their values and their system, and what that does then in relation to your sense that God is the one in control of everything. So as we think of this, we really can think of what are the interests of this group that come to ask him? How do we see in their questions the hypocrisy? How do you think each would answer the question that they ask of Jesus? So if he were to flip this on his head and ask respectively the Pharisees and then the Herodians, which had different opinions on this matter, for their answers, what would their answers be? That may cause you to look up in Wikipedia or on Google, who were the Pharisees, who were the Herodians, so you can understand that more fully. In what ways do we ask similar questions today? So there's a story about my great-grandfather, excuse me, who came over from Iowa when he was a boy. He was between 10 and 12 years old, ended up on the wrong train and ended up in Iowa. And over the course of a lifetime, essentially kept adding more and more property to the original farm that he worked on and bought, to the point where upon his death, half of those properties ended up in possession of the government. Well, how did that happen? Meanwhile, each of his boys got property, and he had a house in town for each of the girls that he had. So he'd been very successful. Well, he made a statement that he never paid his taxes. So it was back taxes that claimed those. And the statement that he made is, the government's never done anything for me, so why should I do anything for the government? Now, this story is from the turn of the last century in some ways, but it does hearken to us or speak to us in the sense of asking us, how are we still caught up in some of this challenge of, we're coming up on April 15th. How do we see taxes as this burden? How do we see that our politicians always use this as a political football to pass back and forth? And yet, when it comes to roads and other realities that help keep things in order, these are essentials that are taxes and therefore our currency, which also gives us the ability to get food and other things of that nature, participate in that. An activity that may be very revealing for us is looking at our own spending habits. So if we created a log in the day for every dollar that we spent, what would it show? And if you go a day or several days without ever spending money, perhaps use it over the course of a week and include all of the bills that you pay and of the other things that you do with your money. So your mortgage, your car, anything, your gas bill, your electric bill, but also every cup of coffee that you buy out, the food that you buy at Wegmans or anything else. What does it reveal about what you value? If you spend the most money on your home, it would say that what you value most is the security of home, of having a place to call your own. To whom or what are we giving our money? How does that indicate what we care most deeply about? What would giving to God, what would giving more to God look like for us? How would that giving honor God? What could we do as individuals? What could we do as a church to risk that giving? How could that change the significance, thinking about the significance of money for us? So it's a little short entry into this. I hope you'll participate in one of the interactive options, as I really think that they give more opportunity to explore and gain an insight into these passages. But Jesus' teachings in the temple, these last public teachings, they challenge us to think about what we value, about what we love, and how we can love God and neighbor more. We sometimes know we have love only when it is tested. And in those times of testing, we can trust the love that Jesus had that offers our raw honesty to God. Let's take a moment and pray. God of love, who walked the journey of life and death with us, in Jesus you are tested and tried. When we are tested and tried, help us remember the love in which we were created and which is never ending. Amen. Thanks for joining me.